Hello everybody and welcome back to another week in review. This time in the division's 7th Estonians and 52nd Sicherungs, suggested about a week ago in the comment section of my last week in review by JMWW2. Remember that if you'd like to see any specific divisions covered in this series or any specific videos in general, leave them in the comments below and I'll either route you to where they already exist or I will get them into the pipeline in chronological order. I said as much last week, but in the description of this video, there will be a link to a Google document that contains all of the battle groups that I've currently reviewed. Those that I have yet to review will be left blank in the battle group and YouTube section, so feel free to suggest any of those. Also, any of those that are highlighted in gray are ones that I've covered before they've made these massive changes to different units and to the ranges of all the tank guns and whatnot. So those ones are mostly out of date, so it wouldn't be remiss of you to suggest redoing any of those old ones. But without further ado, let's hop right into my first iteration of the 7th Estonian Division. Now, both 7th Estonian and 52nd Sichuan were added in the recent Burning Baltic expansion, and as such, this is going to be my first time looking at either of them. I will say right before I get started, and I'll elaborate on this later, but when I was making these two divisions, I actually thought that 7th Estonian was going to be the very difficult one to play, and 52nd Sicherungs was going to be very, very good, but I had almost the opposite reaction to those. That isn't because Sicherungs is weak and 7th is really strong, but I'll get into it when I get there. Leading us off in the recon tab, I have a fairly typical one card of snipers. These guys were just there to support my infantry, but more than that, I was turning off the sniper rifle on these guys more often than not, just so they'd act as recon instead of firing, giving themselves away, and then dying immediately to some tank rolling up on them. In the infantry tab, we have the very interesting Pioneer PPSH. These are just like the really, really old Sapri PPSH that used to be in the game. The TNT wielding nightmare machines that you'd send out in the jeeps and they would do horrifying things to the enemy. Well, they're back in this iteration and they do horrifying things to the enemy. There's really no better way to put it. These guys have TNT, they travel in one of the faster vehicles in the game, and they're fairly difficult to spot without adequate recon or something like that. So you can get these guys into very annoying places, and they can wreak havoc on enemy infantry squads. Moving on, I bring in two cards of Phase A Chernopojachniki. Now, take note that I will be using the Russian names for these, as I've learned how to pronounce the Russian names, more or less, and I don't know if I can pronounce the Estonian ones without causing someone from Eastern Europe to just cringe at my enunciation. So we'll just be using the Russian names for them. I brought in two cards in Phase A, even though they are all available in Phase B for a few reasons. One, if you bring in 3 cards in Phase B, you can't bring in transports for all of them. There's simply not enough of them. 2, it's also too much infantry. Like 27 per card, that's nearly 90 Chernopojachniki just from 3 cards of units. That's insane. I don't need that many infantry. So I decided to bring them in Phase A and sort of just use them as a meat wall. These guys come in such availability that you can just kind of send them out. They'll run at the enemy, they'll fall back, they'll run at the enemy. It'll just be a repeating loop, and they're almost impossible to kill because they keep running away. I also brought in a Phase A card of the Pioneer leaders, and these weren't being used for my infantry by any means. I was using these to maybe buff up an Su-85 that I had brought in, or buff up some of the tanks, but not necessarily the infantry, as the infantry were all more or less running away constantly. In Phase B, I brought in a card of the Tanko Desantniki, a card of the Guardia SVT, and a card of Chernopojachniki. These are all fairly self-explanatory. There's really nothing too special here going on. This is fairly standard for any Russian deck I make. In the last phase, I also brought in another card of the Rifleman with the SVT, as the SVT is just a fantastic weapon, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring in as many as possible. Now, take note, this entire week in review took place the exact week before they did the change to the submachine guns. So the Tanko Desantniki are going to be really, really strong now. The Automachiki are going to be really, really strong now. There's going to be a lot of changes that occurred to that, but I've done all of these changes to this division before that. So if you're looking at this through the lens of that patch that changed around the SFG, the PPSH specifically to fire incredibly quickly, or the changes to the carbines or so on, and thinking, why the hell is he doing this? That's exactly why. I just haven't updated it for that yet. Moving on to the tank tab, I have a Phase A card of the T26Es and a Phase A card of the KV-1Ss. Now, both of these tanks, fairly self-explanatory how I'd use them. The KV-1Ss were mainly there so that I could box with things like Panzer IIIs, though they struggle horrifically with Stug 3s or Panzer IVs. And the T26s were mainly there as infantry support. Being that they're a 20-point tank, they're actually cheaper than a lot of the infantry that I can bring in, and so these guys are just fantastic to just sort of flood around next to my Chernopojachniki that are running away. In Phase B, I brought in a card of the Churchill 4s, and these guys did a job. I mean, it wasn't a great job. It wasn't a terrible job. For 55 points, I don't know if I'd keep them in my division if I had any longer with this division, though. And in Phase C, I brought in a card of the T-34-76s, OBR 1943. These guys did really well. I absolutely adore these tanks for 55 points. I'd pay that all day for a T-34-76. In the support tab, I lead us off with a Phase A card of the Ognamachiki. I know that these guys recently took a nerf, being that they've been reduced by 3 men in Phase A at no stars veterancy, but they're still great at really just sending forward to grab those like tiny forests that you see on any front, and so I still bring them in. I also brought in a Phase A card of the Smersh, and while I'm not falling in love with these military police units, for 15 points for a 9-man squad that came with a few Mosins and a few other things, I think that's a pretty good investment for just infantry, let alone for the military police staff. I would mainly pile these on Chernopojachniki that I didn't want to run away, say it was for a crucial town or something, and just kind of set this guy there so that no one would surrender, no one would fall back, no one would do their little disheartened bullshit, so they would just kind of sit up there and defend the area instead. For 15 points, it's a fairly low investment to make sure that those units don't just die to some random crap. Rounding us out in Phase A, I brought in a Phase A commander, as well as the 52P 353 76.2mm infantry gun. Now, these things, I don't need to say it any more than I already have. They're absolutely fantastic. They will kill light vehicles, they'll kill infantry, they fire fast as sin. It's amazing. I love them to death. Lastly, in my support tab, I brought in a Phase B card of the Studebaker supplies, and again, this is just so I can keep everything supplied later on in the game. Mainly just keeping various artillery pieces and anti-tank guns topped off, such as the Su-85s that run through their APCR like it's going out of style. Moving on to the anti-tank tab, I brought in a card of the PTRS-41s on the motorbikes. This is a fairly standard pick for me. They accompany my Ognamachiki up in the opening, just sort of sit around in light forests and maybe ping off a few of the Beglite series or maybe some lesser Panzer Grenadier before they're able to unload. I've also brought in a Phase A card of the M42 45mm anti-tank gun and a Phase A card of 2-star Su-85s. I brought these in at 2 stars because I needed these guys to be in weird places where I might not have command. I might not be able to pipe it to where these guys are hiding, and I needed the Su-85 to kill heavy tanks. Not to wound them, not to think about them, not to miss them. I needed it to kill them. For the most part, they were successful in that charge also. These guys were fantastic if I just left them about in various spots. You could hide them in light forests on either side of a road and then sneak them out when the tank wasn't facing that direction, fire an APCR, back them up immediately because the enemy tank will fire before the Su-85 reloads. And these guys were just doing great in that role. I would have loved to have more of them, but I think 2 is a good number to have. In Phase B, I also brought in the Su-76 PT, and honest to God, I was using these more as an infantry gun than I was as an AT gun. The HE on the 76mm is really, really good, and so I was just using these to support infantry and occasionally kill light or medium vehicles. My AA tab in this division saw a lot of variety. I brought in 3 cards of Zenart 37s on the Dushka transports. That's really it. That's all I brought in. There's really not a lot of variety there. In the artillery tab, I was bringing in the F-22 76.2mm, and these were being used mainly as AT guns instead of artillery, just to round out my Phase A anti-tank. I didn't have any z.b.V in that opening. I didn't have any z.b.V2s, so I needed something of higher caliber than the 45mm. I also brought in a Phase A card of the off-map to grab an early spot on the map. A Phase B card of artillery commanders, again fairly standard. A Phase B card of F-22s. This is also to round out my anti-tank tab, but if I got enough of them on the map, they were actually really effective as counter battery also. And a Phase B card of the M31 22mm, and these were to secure kills on Tigers, Panthers, you name it. For the most part, my artillery tab was kind of just my anti-tank tab part 2, because the anti-tank tab in this entire division is kind of lackluster. It doesn't have a lot in the way of card slots, and it doesn't have a lot in the way of usable units, so bringing in everything in the artillery tab to sort of supplement that felt right to me. Lastly, in my air tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the LA-5N fighter bombers, a Phase B card of the LA-5N air superiority fighters, a Phase B card of the Yermo 2 with some amount of bombs I don't exactly remember, and a Phase C card of the Yermo 2 with a different amount of bombs. Again, the Yermos were just there to bomb things. I didn't care which caliber bomb they had. If I sent 3 of these at a tank, it usually exploded, and that's exactly what I needed. Moving on to my deck at the end of the week, and we mainly see only quality of life changes. The deck itself performed very, very well for what I wanted it to do, and so I didn't need to make a lot of changes throughout the week to it. It was very bizarre to me. In the Recon tab, I brought in an additional card of Recon in Phase B in the form of the Motrezvedka, just to give me more eyes, and these eyes didn't have sniper rifles, so they oftentimes didn't just fire and give themselves away in the situations where they otherwise wouldn't have been spotted. We don't see any more changes until I get down to the support tab, where I've dropped the Smash. They were good. I have nothing terrible to report about them, but I needed Recon more, and so I ended up dropping them. Dropping down to the AA tab, I ended up dropping the Phase C card of Zenart 37s, as they were great, but I wasn't bringing in all of them, so 9 seemed like a viable number to bring in throughout the game, especially if I was good at micromanaging the LA-5s. Lastly, in the artillery tab, I used those 2 points to pick up an Arjusha because I had a lot of anti-tank guns in my artillery tab, but I didn't have a lot of artillery, and occasionally I needed to just erase a section of the map or surrender out that section. What I found really odd about this division is that while I was making it, and subsequently anytime I played it, I would look at each of these units and think, well, this is just not going to be enough to do X, Y, or Z. These infantry aren't going to be enough to beat their infantry, these tanks, so on and so forth. However, every time I played this division, I was pleasantly surprised. Everything in this division performed at or better than my expectations, and because of that, it actually set itself really far ahead in my mind of where I thought it would be. There's really nothing in this division that is a, quote, super unit. There's nothing in this division that will fire and kill a Tiger in a single shot, other than the M30 if it hits for some miracle. But because of that, I kind of just, every time seeing this division, underestimated what it could do, and I was pleasantly just wrong. The hordes of infantry that you can summon in this division are truly catastrophic. It's such that you sort of build up this huge force of infantry that keeps rolling and keeps rolling and keeps rolling, and if the enemy hasn't dealt with it by the time Phase C hits, there's just about 100 Chernopajachniki on the map coming to just kill everything on the opposing team. I will say though that because of the horde mentality of this division, it requires a bit more micromanaging than you'd otherwise have in any division. It doesn't have the one unit IS-2 that's capable of doing just about anything. Just leave it alone and it'll work. It's a lot more of like, oh, you guys hide in this forest, you guys advance through this forest, so on and so forth. And because of that, it can be kind of overwhelming. What's more, it is a kind of counterintuitive way to do battle for those that are newer at strategy games, just because you have a horde of things that by themselves are kind of pointless. Any one Chernopajachniki squad cannot beat any one enemy infantry squad. It's almost impossible for them to kill anything north of a Erzatstruppen, but because there are just so many of them, they will eventually just roll them over. Because of that, I would kind of advise staying away from this division if you're newer to the game. It doesn't really teach you how to play the game as a whole. It teaches you how to play the game as a flood sort of scenario. And it is a very effective flood, but a flood nonetheless. Another reason I'd stick away from this division if I was a newer player is because it does require a lot of micromanagement on the anti-tank portion of things. The M3122s and the Su-85s are both great units in their own right, but require a lot of babying to work absolutely well. All in all though, this deck does perform very, very well. I played this in all three of the team game modes, 2v2, 3v3, and 4v4, not counting 10v10s for what I feel are obvious reasons, but it performed really well in all of them. I don't know that it has a weakest sort of deployment against two or more players, 3 or more players, so on and so forth. And that's mainly because no matter the amount of ground that you have to cover, you have more than enough things to do that with. Your things all cost 10, 25 points at most, and so you're able to just sort of flood over any period of ground, regardless of the amount of ground that is. With the changes recently made to carbines and different weapon types in the most recent patch, I imagine this will only get worse, being that it's sort of leaning back towards that high time of spam beating carefully planned pushes no matter what. But I digress from the reality of this video. All in all, this was one of the more fun Horde style decks that I've played throughout this series. I don't know that it's absolutely one of my favorite decks. I don't even know that I liked this deck all that much. However, it was a lot of fun occasionally seeing 100 Chernobylachniki march across the open and eventually seize a tank or something that they just shouldn't be able to take care of on their own. Moving on, we have my first iteration of the 52nd Sicherungs division. Now this division, when I was putting it together, I was like, this is the one. Panthers and a Horde, this is going to be absolutely amazing. And I'll get into why that wasn't the case 100% of the time later on in this video, but suffice it to say that this division ended up letting me down quite a bit. Granted, I do not blame the division. However, I was using it incorrectly some of the time I was paired up with people that I just couldn't end up getting over that hill. Sometimes it was a few other reasons, but we'll get into that when we get there. In my recon tab, I start off with a phase A card of snipers, and again, fairly standard, turn off the sniper rifle if I wanted these guys to survive a long time, just so they wouldn't give themselves away, or occasionally use them as infantry support if they were in a good enough spot. In phase B, I round out this tab with the Aufklärer Panther D, and this is needed. You need this card of Panther Ds where it is. This is literally the first armored vehicle that you have access to in this division. Phase B Panther Ds in the recon tab are non-negotiable for this division. In the infantry tab, I have a phase A card of the Flaktruppen. These guys are phase locked to phase A, and they are fantastic. 15-man squads, 15 points apiece. That is literally 1 point per man, and that is insane value. I also have a phase A card of the Tar Savonry. I don't know if I've pronounced that properly or even close, but we're going to move on with it. These guys were decent. 11 men for 15 points. 15 points is really my favorite amount of points to spend on infantry, so I thought these guys were going to be great. Rounding us out, I have a phase A leader as well as a phase A card of the Fallschirm Sturmpioneer. These guys were my sort of elite units of this phase. They came in the horse transport and they have obviously the flames, so I was sending these guys forward in lieu of like Flammenwerfer to take light forests or heavy forests in some instances, and they more than excelled at that. The one detriment to these guys is that they do pack a rifle instead of all submachine guns, so occasionally they will engage outside of flame range, and that is no good for anybody. Moving on to phase B, I have these Let conscripts that are absolutely amazing. Again, 15 points for a 10-man squad. It doesn't even matter what they have. They're just absolutely fantastic. 24 people per card. It's absolutely amazing. It doesn't even matter what they bring in. I also brought in the Let Legionary, and these are 9-man squads for 20 points. A little bit beefier, a little bit, I struggled to say more elite, but they were doing the job that I needed them to for 20 points, and they did have the capability to kill a tank should they be standing right on top of one. I also brought in a phase B card of Pioneer to deal with those heavy forests, and a phase B card of Fallschirmjäger to act as my mega infantry for this entire division. I brought them in at 1 star. I don't remember if they were phase locked to 1 star or if I did that on purpose, but I would have done it even if they weren't. Fallschirmjäger work best the higher fire rate that they have, and so Just seemed like a no-brainer. Finally, in Phase C, I brought in more of these 15-point Raider units, and I thought this was going to be enough infantry. Little did I know that math doesn't work that way, and because all of these infantry only cost 15 points, I would bring them in sort of 4 balls to cost the same as a 2 ball of regular infantry. I'll get into why this infantry tab didn't end up working for me a little later on, but for now we'll move on to the tank tab. In Phase C, starting in Phase C, I brought in 2 cards of Panther A's at 1 star and a Panther A Führer. My thought process here was to bring them up to 3 stars, but being that it was so late in the game, almost always my commander was dead at this point because I had no armored support on the map to stop whatever it was from coming for him, or I'd have to delay the commander until Phase C. It was just a whole mess. In the support tab, I have a Phase A card of the SMG-42s, a Phase A commander, and for the most part, this was enough for Phase A. The MG42 is absolutely fantastic at suppressing infantry. I know that's slightly changed with the recent patch, but I imagine that it will still be part of the meta. In Phase B, I have these god tier military police units that come equipped with 4 MP44s and a sniper rifle at a Force 2-star veterancy for 15 points. If you're not bringing in the Feldjäger in this deck, I think you're playing this division wrong, like very, very wrong. These things are absolutely fantastic to use as infantry support, to keep your horde of conscripts from falling back, or just to use as regular infantry even. They come in the horse transport, they're really fast, 5-man squad is hard to spot, and they do have a sniper rifle to aid in those long-ranged engagements, while also being very useful in close-ranged engagements with their 4 MP44s. In Phase B, I also brought in a card of the IG-18 infantry guns and a Phase B card of Opel Blitz munitions. In the anti-tank tab, I lead us off with a card of Phase A Panzerbuchse 39s in the motorbikes and a Phase A card of the Panzerrücklings, rounding us all out with a Pak 40 75mm AT gun. My thought with the Panzerbuchses was to sort of use them as a PTRS team, and for the most part they did that. They're a little bit cheaper, they're a little bit less effective, but for the most part they were able to snipe out enemy vehicles before they were able to unload, and for that I was grateful, but I don't know how useful that ended up being. In Phase B, I brought in a card of the Panzerschrecks, as well as the stolen z.b.V, and in Phase C, I rounded it all out with the Jagdpanzer IV. While this is a lot of Panzerschrecks, I feel like it was necessary. The number of infantry that you have access to just really lends itself to sending forward a Panzerschreck squad with each ball of infantry, and so I stick by that amount of Panzerschrecks. In the anti-air tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Flak 36s, a Phase B card of the Mobilwagens, and a Phase B card of the stolen Zenart 85 conscript AA pieces. In the artillery tab, I lead us off with a Phase B card of the artillery commanders, a Phase B card of the SDKFZ 251/2 81mm mortar carriers, and a Phase B card of the M3122s just to help secure those heavy tank kills, hopefully before my Panthers arrive in Phase C. Lastly, in the air tab, we're bringing in the Me-109 GTAC-6 in Phase A at a 1-star veterancy, a Phase A card of the FW-190 FTAC-8 fighter bombers, a Phase B card of the DO-217 KTAC-1s, and a Phase C card of the same plane with different munitions. For the most part, this air tab was meant to sort of keep a snowball rolling. These FW-190s oftentimes got away with their initial bombing runs, and planes in this game get exponentially more valuable the more bombing runs that they get away with, so I was sort of exercising that to its fullest. Moving on to my division at the end of the week, and this one saw quite a few changes. I found that oftentimes I was running out of infantry, if that can be believed. Even though this deck has a lot more infantry than I'd otherwise bring in say, an armored division, it wasn't enough. Like, somehow I was spending through all my infantry in 40 minutes and just having nothing for the back half of the game should it go on for longer than that. Because of this, I ended up bringing in another card of Phase C Panzergrenadier with the Panzerfaust, as these were the most numerous units that I could bring in at this point, and so just bringing those in, maybe the dual MG42s could do something for me, maybe the Panzerfaust gets a kill, but it was mainly just to have additional units on the map. In the tank tab, I've dropped the veterancy on the Panthers to no stars and dropped a card of them as such, so there's no change in the amount of Panthers, just a change in the value of the Panthers. We see no change in the support tab. However, in the AT tab, I did pick up a card of the z.b.V because I running out of high caliber anti-tank guns also, which is bizarre for this division. We're able to afford all of this because in the artillery tab, I've dropped the Phase B card of M30s and the Phase B mortar carriers in favor of just using the Panther D to do whatever we needed it to do. In the air tab, I've also swapped out the Phase A air superiority fighter in favor of the HE-111 in Phase B so that I could have more bombs instead of a worthless ASF that couldn't catch anything anyway. This deck was a very intriguing division to play throughout the week. I found that while it has all of the makings of something that I would really enjoy, heavy tanks, a horde of infantry, a lot of really good anti-tank options, a lot of really good bombers, it didn't combine them in a way that was usable by me. I prefer my aggression early and throughout the entire game, and being that my Panthers and any armored vehicle was phase locked to a later phase, I found I was really struggling with this division. I was putting forth the same aggression that I typically do, and because of that, I was losing a lot of my units before I was able to actually back them up. As I said in my opening, this is not a failing of this division. This division itself seems very, very strong, and if I could wrap my head around how to play it properly, waiting until Phase C, building up that force, then I think it would be very, very powerful. However, it's just not quite my playstyle. For the most part, all of the infantry did very, very well in this division. They were all very, very great. As conscripts go, these guys were cheap. They gave me a lot of meat on the map, and as elite units go, the Fallschirmjäger, the Panzergrenadier, and the Pioneer squads were doing a great job of sort of filling in the gaps that were left by those conscript units, taking all of the fire onto the conscripts units, and then using the Fallschirmjäger to sort of kill all the enemy infantry. What's more, the support tab in this division is really great. The Feldjäger are amazing, the MG42 is great, the IG-18 is great, and the anti-tank tab is fantastic. The Jagdpanzers are great, the FK-288 or z.b.V is amazing at suppressing infantry, and all of your AA tab units are also really great at helping infantry engagements should they need to. I honestly think that my only problem with this division is that you can't bring in a Phase A card of one tank, just one single tank. Even if it was just the Jagdpanzer IV, I think would have been enough. All in all though, I did have a lot more fun playing this division than I did the other, even though I was losing more often with this division just because of my playstyle. I really enjoyed having options in those later phases. Being able to bring in a Panther and just use that to kill enemy tanks was really special to me. I don't know exactly why, but I really like having at least one unit that I can rely on in any division, even if it is a horde division. I also can't state enough how much in love I am with the Feldjäger. The Feldjäger do a fantastic job of supporting infantry. They do an amazing job of keeping the conscript debuff off of them, and I would bring these guys in even if they weren't military police. If they were just 15-point units in the infantry tab, I would still bring these units in. There's also something to be said about the air tab in that it gets access to a lot of really powerful bombers. Not necessarily bombers with high caliber explosives, but there are those too, but mainly bombers that are going to get away with multiple runs, and that's incredibly important to how I use these bombers. They sort of hit a critical mass scenario where if you had all 8 of them flying in at the same time, they were impossible to shoot down even with a concerted AA effort unless they were flying planes around to stop them. And so long as your AA effort was equally concerted, those planes weren't going to get very far either. Whereas I discouraged players that are newer to the game from playing the earlier Horde division, I think this one is a lot more in favor of learning how to play the game. It still has access to units that can perform under their own autonomy, such as the Panther A or a few other, such as the AA tab, but it also gives you access to a large amount of infantry that you're capable of using. What's more, it plays into that new player mentality of waiting until Phase C, which can be a really dangerous habit to learn. I don't know if I'd recommend it or if I'd stay away from it if I was a newer player. What frightens me is people learning how to play with this division, waiting until Phase C to get their Panthers online, waiting until Phase B to get their off-color Panthers, or whatever it may be, and then sort of applying that same logic to every division, which every division is not in the same vein. I know it's especially true in the reverse for me, being that I'm much more used to pushing early in phases A and B, and then this division requires that I wait until phase C to have most of my support options online, and because of that I really struggled with this division. So I imagine the reverse would also be true if I had learned how to play with 50-second Sicherung instead. For the most part, this division does really well in any game type also, 2v2s, 3v3s, and so on, just because of the number of things that you're able to put forth. The Pak 40s are more than adequate, and the z.b.V are more than adequate to be sort of anti-tank support against much heavier options, and the Panther A is really able to box most anything save for an IS-2 at 2 kilometers. That said though, if the IS-2 misses its shot, anything 1500 meters and below, the Panther A will likely kill it. The Panther just fires faster, is more accurate, and packs just a better overall tank into the same square footage, as it were. All in all though, that is going to do it for this week in review of 7th Estonian and 52nd Sicherung. Remember that if you'd like to see any specific divisions covered in this series, or if you'd like to see any specific videos, leave them in the comments below and I will get to them as soon as possible. As always, I hope you guys have learned something.